Thesis. Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.
Hello, I am Scott Allen, and thanks to my daughter Kate for developing the intro to the Practical Wisdom for Leaders podcast, where we offer a smart, fast-paced discussion on all things leadership. My guests help us explore timely topics and incorporate practical tips to help you make a difference in how you lead and live. If you haven't done so, please click subscribe so you automatically, seamlessly stay in the know when we publish new episodes. Likewise, please provide me with feedback. What do you like? What do you dislike? And what else would you like to know? And now, today's show. Today on the podcast, I have Dr. Eliane Ubalijoro. And she is an incredible woman. She serves on the board of the International Leadership Association. She is a doctor of molecular genetics, which I can't wait to hear from that. Originally hails from Rwanda, lives in Canada currently. She is a woman who has many different interests around STEM, leadership development, sustainability. I'm probably missing a bunch, Dr. Eliane, but why don't you tell us a little bit about you? What have I missed in all of that?
No, I think you've covered a lot. I mean, I'm definitely also interested in gender and how gender interacts with STEM and sustainability. But yes, I think leadership matters. Leadership matters even more urgently now that we are in this COVID era. And my background as a scientist and my interest in leadership, I feel are intersecting right now in the world, because not a lot of people outside of the scientific field realize that the fact that we're facing this COVID crisis is an environmental crisis, because we are at a time in the planet where 60%, we face 60% extinction rate in terms of species around the world. And that over 90% of the landmass of mammals in the world is humans, pets, and livestock. So if you think about it, less than 10% is giraffes, elephants, lions out there in the world. So we represent the largest population for hosts for emerging diseases in the world.
Wow.
Yeah, and so the more people realize that we need to keep biodiversity in the world so that humanity can thrive, and that we realize it's not about healthcare in a country, a state, but it's really about planetary health and how we're interconnected in it, the more we can really get out of this and really have a reset that changes how humanity relates to nature.
Okay, so you just, I think that was a beautiful foundation from which we can explore. Before we started, I said, I have no clue where this is going to go, and I'm excited. Okay, let's unpack a little bit of what you said. There's an intersectionality between your interest in the sciences and interest in sustainability and the welfare of our planet with leadership.
Yes.
And talk more about how you see that, Eliane, because I think that's a beautiful perspective. How do you see those intersecting?
So, if we look at the climate crisis around the world, you have climate deniers and the people who believe in climate. And the reality is climate isn't a partisan issue. Climate is a scientific fact with data that backs it. If you're living, whether you're living in Miami, whether you're living in New York, whether you're living in Amsterdam, or Bangladesh, you can see that events are happening that are disturbing how you live and how, floods, things are happening in the world at an intensity that we haven't seen.
Yes.
And so that is just the reality we need to face. And I think we live in a world where issues that are scientific based are being categorized as issues that correspond to a certain political affiliation. And there's something fundamentally dangerous about that, because there's human issues and then there are partisan issues. And some things should not be partisan issues. I think that's a really important distinction. And it's also a huge issue we're facing right now. It is, how do we take care of humanity? And how do we also look at what our personal values are, the values we'd like governments to have, corporations to have, and make sure that our desires are not conflicting with the welfare of humanity and the planet.
Yeah. Well, and they seem to be, right?
Yes.
If I just watched a fascinating documentary on the BBC. It was David Attenborough. I don't know
Okay.
if you've watched that on Netflix. Have you seen it?
I haven't seen it. You're the third person that says I need to watch it, including my husband, who's already
Yes.
watched it.
Please do,
Okay.
because
Yes.
my family, we have loved watching his work over the years,
Mm-hmm.
and he's of course got that voice that is,
Yes.
so
Beautiful.
wonderful. And this episode, it literally kind of concerned our children. It really got to them because we've
Mm-hmm.
watched the very optimistic documentaries that have existed. And there's another one that Will Smith did called One Strange Planet, which is beautiful. It's a
Yes, I've
wonderful
seen some of
series.
those episodes. Yes.
But it's shifts are occurring.
Mm-hmm.
The science would back that.
Yes.
And to your point, it's not a political issue. It's an issue facing humanity. And what
Mm-hmm.
do we do to solve for that? There seems to be a fundamental leadership challenge embedded in that, because the people trying to solve for that in some ways are losing the influence battle, so to speak. Just like the influence battle that the epidemiologists would have kind of wanted to communicate, the process of influencing others towards a common vision, wear a mask, that's politicized. It's occurring to various degrees, at least here in the United States for sure, as we exponentially increase in cases and deaths now. It's fascinating. And scientists by nature aren't really thinking about how to influence. They're looking for objective fact. So it's almost, is it counterintuitive in some ways for them?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
They think that the logic should just make the case, and we're humans.
Yes, and this is where I think science meeting indigenous wisdom is really important,
Huh.
because indigenous wisdom really has always been based on storytelling. What is our capacity to tell stories that speak to our minds, our hearts, and our souls?
Wow.
And I think what is needed in the 21st century is for scientists to really engage in speaking at those three levels. And it's not taught in programs in science, but it's a
Indigenous storytelling is not taught. It wasn't in your
no,
molecular genetics 101 course.
It wasn't. But coming from Rwanda, I have memories of my childhood sitting on the ground evenings around a fire and listening to an elder tell stories.
Yeah.
And those stories stayed with me. I may not remember the details of the stories, but how those stories made me feel are really important.
Yes.
And Maya Angelou says, we may not remember what people said, but we'll remember how they made us feel. And so as scientists, we have to really think about that, because people will glaze over facts. But if you tell the story of a person who's been through something and has overcome that, and had to find a creative way, owning their hero or heroine's journey in terms of moving forward, that stays with us. That speaks to us. And it also speaks to the yearning in the world right now. If you look at the highest grossing movies around the world, they're all about heroic journeys.
Yeah.
And there are more and more of these big blockbuster heroic journey movies coming out, because we are yearning to own our personal heroes' journeys. And we don't know how to do that. And what often happens is, when we feel that we don't have the power to do that, we will project that onto others and hope that they can lead for us. And that's a bit of the danger we're faced today, because when we project that, then we don't feel like we really have power on the planet to change things, but we definitely do. And I think what we need today is citizen power, citizens around the world realizing that everything they do matters, how they vote matters, whether they vote or not matters.
Yes.
And that every single thing we do, the choices of what we buy, the industries we support, all of it matters, and all of it is interconnected.
Can we stick on this storytelling for a little bit? Eliane, talk more about that. Talk more about how storytelling could, in some ways, transform mindsets. Because I think it's a powerful insight. I really do. Because we have data that at least the attempts that have been made so far, have not necessarily taken root, right? I was mentioning the documentary with David Attenborough that we watched, and we watched the Greta Thunberg documentary the other night as well, and that then again kind of worried our children more. But it's important for them to be aware of those issues, and it's important for them to see a young woman taking a stand and trying to make a difference in the world.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
But talk more about stories, and talk more about how you think stories could shape and shift mindsets and change the narrative a little bit. I think it's a fascinating insight.
So if I think of Wangari Maathai, who was a Kenyan Nobel laureate who won the Peace Prize for promoting tree planting, something as simple as planting trees, and her movement, the Green Belt movement, became a social movement beyond Kenya, and allowed planting of over 1 billion trees around the world. And how she started out is she just she had memories of her childhood where river streams were clear, where there were these big trees where people could sit in the shade and tell stories.
Yeah.
And as those trees were being cut down, erosion was happening, flooding was happening, how communities interacted was changing. The temperatures were rising around the places where she lived, and that was influencing the rates of diseases like malaria. And so what she did is she really went from how do we tell the stories of where we come from to realize that where we are has changed, and that our environment has changed, and that we can, just by women coming together and planting trees together, we can work on these issues of erosion, around flooding, of soils being able to hold more water so we can overcome resilience when there are floods, or when there's not enough water, that there's water enough in the soils to keep the ground cover green and beautiful, and trees thriving, and having places in the shade where we can sit and talk. And so connecting what we do with the stories that narrate our lives is really important. And I think for scientists, that capacity to do that is really important. There's a book that just came out in September called All We Can Save, that is a compilation of essays of women, mostly in the US, of all origins, just stories about how their personal lives have been impacted by climate change, or how their work and social change, the resistance they face. But it's stories about how they're going about their days, what they're facing. So it's not just about giving numbers. It's about really concretely saying, how are different populations affected? Why is it the most vulnerable populations are often poor and of color, in terms of how cities are designed around the areas that are most susceptible? Often what we have is you can have wetlands. Wetlands are areas that normally are sponges. So they can hold a lot of water if there's really heavy, heavy rains. And when there aren't heavy rains, they can allow water to flow to the other areas. And so, but often what we've done is we've eliminated these wetlands, and we've moved people in those areas. And often the people who live there are poor. And so if we look at New Orleans, what happened is, after the terrible events that happened there, the Black population, I think, halved, because people were never able to go back to the areas they lived, because they were places where the ecosystem was really fragile, and there were immense difficulties in figuring out how do we actually reclaim those areas for long-term resilience.
Yeah.
And so it's when we tell stories, then people are like, oh, this is how this affects other people, or this is how it affects me.
Yeah.
And so those are the things that really matter. And if we think about when Sandy hit the East Coast, people were like, oh, this is true. You can get flooding happening and coming to Manhattan. This could get worse. Yeah. And so that's when people, that imagery, the meeting of all our senses and science come together. And we realize that this isn't about politics. This is about humanity and survival.
I love what you just said. That was beautiful.
Thank you.
So the meeting of all of our senses and science.
Yes.
That might be the name of the episode. Well, and it's also interesting how I was not familiar with that story. The story of, and I can't even recall her name right now. Can you say it again? Nobel
Oh,
Prize winner?
Wangari Maathai.
Okay, I'm going to put her story in the show notes so
Okay,
listeners
great.
can find that. But I also love the framing. I agree we should save the rainforests. Yes, for sure. But that has a certain political connotation to it. Oh, they're left leaning. But if it's, hey, let's go plant trees, not
Yes.
not a lot of people are like, no, you're a liberal, you're a conservative. No. And so you're shifting and doing good in the world and helping. And 1 billion trees, was it?
Yes.
1 billion?
Yes. Yes.
So interesting. But that's the type of thinking. There was an interesting statement that was made, and I don't know, it may have been a psychiatrist, but as soon as, at least in the States, and I'd love to get your thoughts on this, Eliane, as soon as it was framed as, well, if you wear a mask, you protect others. It's a very different framing than wearing a mask and protecting yourself. And it's very interesting that subtle difference of what is going to drive human behavior. And it's absolutely fascinating. My family was in a national park probably mid-October, and I was absolutely amazed at the number of people who were not wearing masks on these trails, huffing and puffing up steep inclines, and the individuals are not able to consider others and put on a mask. And so my family has on the mask and we're sweating and it just blew me away. But how these things are framed, and to the point of how to what you just said, of the stories that are being told and how this is being communicated, and how we in all reality shape and shift the hearts and minds of others. Incredibly difficult work.
It's difficult work, but it's the most important work.
Yeah.
And so part of it, I realize, is also realizing that we don't all share the same worldviews.
Yep.
And so some people may be more individualistic, and
Yep.
some people may believe in protecting community. And for the people protecting community, saying wear masks to protect others may be good.
Yep.
But for the people who actually are individualistic, you need to tell them wear masks to protect yourself.
Yes.
And so it's working with what are the narratives that work. And I think in storytelling, there's the trickster. The trickster is always trying to figure out how to bring humor to our idiosyncrasies. And it's really important because the trickster has a sense of what it is our values are, and we work with our values to show us where we hold contradictions and do it in a gentle way that allows us to laugh at ourselves.
Yes.
Without the resistance or violence that a political debate would bring on. And this is also one of the archetypes that I think scientists need to come up today and work with. And I think of the technology economist, historian, Carlota Perez, and so she has studied how innovation has evolved over centuries. And one of the things she says is right now we're in the fourth industrial revolution, so digitalization and this virtual world that we're all really happy to be able to access to, for many of us to keep working.
Sure.
And what she says is the fifth industrial revolution will be green. And what she says, it's not about fear mongering around this is the end of the world, is how do we make green sexy? How do we make it aspirational? How do we tell stories that make people want to associate green with the most beautiful, luxurious lifestyles, having less but of better quality?
Yes.
And so part of it is, and that can go against the rational mind, because the rational mind is like, why should I appeal to that part of you that wants to dream? But if you think about it, who doesn't know Martin Luther King's "I Have a Dream" speech?
Sure.
You may not know the whole, but you know this, how that resonates. And so part of it is touching the primal parts of us as human is really important. And also the reality that the rational brain doesn't resonate at the same level as compassion or love. And so I can tell my child, okay, here's what I want you to do for rational reasons. Okay. Or I can say, we're a family, we love each other, and we take care of each other. And so you cleaning your room is part of you showing me that you care because of what I do for you and what you can do for me. So reciprocity. And so
Yes.
then I'm talking at a heart level. I could say, I need you to clean your room because I want to limit microbial growth on your desk.
Microbial growth. I love it.
That isn't going to work. That isn't going to work. And so this is the real importance we have today of what is it that certain leaders who are nationalistic and who are having these powerful narratives that are capturing people, because they are using storytelling.
Yeah.
They're not using it in the ways that I would like them to do in terms of increasing our interconnectedness and our capacity to vision and have action towards more sustainability in the world, but they're capturing minds.
Yes. And yeah, I'm reminded of John Cotter. He had a book called Heart of Change. And in that book, there was a passage that always kind of stood with me, which was the single most important message. This book is very simple. People change what they do less because they're given analysis that shifts their thinking than because they are shown a truth that influences their feelings. And that's counterintuitive for a scientist. It's counterintuitive because I've given you the facts, I've given you the data, now do the right thing. Versus Cotter's perspective on that topic. And I agree with you. I think some individuals are incredible at weaving a storyline. And whole media outlets are incredible at weaving a storyline. In some cases on both sides, right? And kind of picking and choosing elements that communicate that narrative. But I'm wondering, does the whole premise, Eliane, almost go against scientific inquiry? Do you come across scientists who think, well, why should I now go try and sell this? That's not my role, and that's not science.
Well, here's the thing. I think part of it is how we see our roles, and
Yeah.
there's a difference between I'm going to go out to sell this.
Yeah.
I'm going to go out to educate people,
Yes.
empower people, and influence people to embrace science.
Yeah.
And so I think it's really important. And this is the thing about mindset and worldviews is it's important to work with scientists in ways that they don't feel that they're selling, because it's not about selling.
Yeah.
It's about how does the hard work that they do have greater reach.
Wow.
Who doesn't want to have greater reach?
Yeah.
And so it's really important. And it comes down to, do we want to have transactional relationships with people or transformational relationships?
Yeah.
And this is where, you were talking about John Cotter, and that's why there's something amazing about his work in leadership and his definition of the differentiation between management and leadership, where he says management is, controlling systems and things, and leadership is about imagining, designing new systems.
Yeah. Yep.
And for me, coming from a country in Africa that is one of the smallest, fragile, post-conflict countries in the world, is we have to imagine everything. So what we're looking for aren't managers. We're looking for leaders that have the capacity to dream and to execute their dreams into reality.
Yeah.
And so that is all about leadership and transformation. And, back to John Cotter, in his change series of book, the last one was the on the iceberg and the colonies, I think, were of penguins. Was it penguins?
Yes.
And so what he realized is that was this third iteration of how do we bring about change. He was like, I need to go storytelling. So this is a Harvard professor.
Yes.
Going from theory to, here's a story of a colony of penguins, and they're faced with an iceberg melting, and how do they work as a community to figure out how to move forward? How do you identify champions? How do you tell stories in ways that people will be willing to let go of something? Because change is about loss. So managing loss is deeply emotional.
Yes.
And so this is where storytelling does something that science doesn't, is it connects to our heart, and it has us aspiring to something that allows us to say, yes, I'm going to be losing something, but I will gain something. And so this is where change is really critical. And that's why I think he went to storytelling. And that's why I think it's important for scientists to go there. And what's also really interesting for me is if you look at most of the science Nobel Prize winners, many of them were also artists. So I think of Barbara McClintock, who was a geneticist, and she discovered something that at the time we called jumping genes.
Yeah.
She was a jazz musician, you know?
Yeah.
And there's something about being able to be a scientist and have an artistic eye that we nurture that allows us to take our science and share it with people in unexpected ways that really can transform the world.
I love it. I love it. And you said something in there that reminded me of the Ron Heifetz quote from Leadership on the Line. It was habits, values, and attitudes, even dysfunctional ones, are a part of someone's identity. And so to change the way people see and do things, that's actually changing how they define themselves, which makes the work even that much more complex in so many ways, right? That if you had your way, would this education be embedded in the work of scientists?
Absolutely.
And is it anywhere in the world, Eliane? Is there some place that an epidemiologist could go right now to help frame how they communicate, how they educate, how they influence others to make decisions in their best interest to live a more healthy life at this moment? Is there any place?
Well, so there are places. I think of leadership programs that are out there specifically for scientists, and there's some that are. I think of the organization Future Earth and their leadership program for climate scientists.
Okay.
You know, it's part of how do you use your science in ways that allow you to empower, influence, and bring about change. In Rwanda, where I'm from, where the headquarters of the African Institutes of Mathematical Sciences is based. So they've had a series of Next Einstein Fellows, and I helped select the 2020 fellows. And part of the fellows that win this prize, what they have in terms of the benefits is learning how to communicate and tell stories.
Oh, nice.
Yes. And so I do think this is something that is happening through different fellowship programs. It would be great that it becomes embedded in university programs. I think because of the concept of planetary health coming out and transdisciplinary nature of planetary health, there is a requirement for storytelling in terms of how we move that forward. And also, I think if you think about it, more and more you have conferences where you have infography, where somebody is actually drawing the story of the conversation that's being told. And this is something that is really allowing us to have dialogue turn into art that influences us. And that's also, images have a capacity to bypass our barriers. And so part of becoming more powerful in terms of what we do requires engaging in storytelling and art form. And, you know, Howard Gardner, 3 Characteristics of Extraordinary Leaders or People is...
Was that Leading Minds? Was that book? Are you going back to Leading Minds right now? That's awesome.
Yeah. And so he says the capacity reflection, cultivating daily reflection.
Okay.
Capacity to frame and capacity to leverage.
Yeah.
So it's, what is our capacity to reflect on a regular basis, whether it's meditation, it's running, walking in nature, cultivating any type of art form or prayer that allows us to ground and turn the inner eye and reflect inner. So we think about the inner game of leadership.
Yeah.
And then capacity to frame. What is our capacity to tell stories so we have followers?
Yeah.
And then leveraging is how do we actually have that become into social movements that bring about changes that we could have imagined.
Yeah.
And so those are things I think are really important in terms of how do we look at extraordinary people and what they've done for good, and how do we leverage that in what we're doing so that whatever we do can have that much more influence in allowing humanity to transform towards greater sustainability.
I love how you're thinking. I've never had this conversation before, and it's so much fun. And it's reminding me, Steve Kempster from Lancaster University, and I recorded a podcast with him. It was a little bit of a different topic, but it's, how do you use capitalism against itself to transform, right? And so one of my favorite quotes is every system's perfectly designed for the results that it achieves. Every system's perfectly designed for the results that it achieves. And that's been attributed to a bunch of different people. But we have data. Here we are. Here's the system. And we have certain results. And so what new type of thinking, what innovations, what other areas can we learn from to help shift movement, to make progress, to help us make decisions that's in our best interest?
So this is really,
Right?
it's a really good point. And there's a concept that I find really interesting is the idea of stakeholder capitalism. How do we have capitalist systems that look at not only the stockholders but really the stakeholders?
Yes.
And
Oh yeah.
and that changes how we look at systems, and so it changes the type of data we're looking at, and so it changes how we design for success and measure success. In September, I joined the new board called the Capitalist Coalition, and the Capitalist Coalition Supervisory Board. And so what the Capitalist Coalition is all about is how do we count for nature, so natural capital, social capital, and human capital in all that we do.
Wow.
And how could we bring measurements around that, whether it's government, nonprofit, for-profit, but in everything we do?
Yep.
How is everything we're doing having a positive effect on nature?
Yep.
How is it having a positive effect on people's skills in terms of human capital? How is it having a positive effect in terms of community building?
Yes.
And if we frame everything we do to take all of that into account, that would transform how we go about all business, education, taking care of everything. And so that's a concept that I find really interesting and holistic. And in a way, again, going back to Indigenous wisdom, because Indigenous wisdom is about looking at the whole and how we are part of something bigger.
Yeah. Yeah. Eliane, what else are you thinking about right now? What's some of the thoughts that are keeping your mind?
Well,
not genetics, this stuff, not that stuff. We just leadership stuff. It's a different podcast.
Well,
jumping genes and such isn't really the focus here, whatever those were.
Okay. Well, I still think it's exciting. But part of it, there are two things that I'm thinking about a lot right now is how do we cultivate mindfulness at a collective level? And how does that influence our capacity to get through highly anxious times? Because we are in highly anxious times right now.
Yeah.
And it's not about just me cultivating my mindfulness and my meditation, yoga practice, journaling, but it's how do we collectively allow everybody to have the safety to nurture their souls in this world in ways that increases our collective vibration so that human consciousness is vibrating at a higher level.
Yeah.
And so that, I would say, is something that I deeply believe in and am committed to in terms of how do we elevate human consciousness. And also, because of this virtual world we're in, how does digitalization affect our capacity to elevate human consciousness or decrease human consciousness? And so part of it is, as we're looking at artificial intelligence, digitalization, and this network that is connecting us virtually around the world, the cloud that we're connecting with. Yeah. But if you think about spirituality, and spirituality is in terms of what is it that connects all beings? Yeah. What is it that makes me part of the universe? Okay, and I'm going to go back to science just a little bit. But if you think about it, is we are all our atoms are from stardust.
Yeah.
So we are vibrating with the whole universe.
Yes.
And so if we really look at ourselves as this web of knowledge and possibility universally, but then now we're creating this digital web. And so in a way, this digital web is a reflection of the level of consciousness that we currently have. Yeah. And so I think there's a real importance of saying, how do we bring a cosmological worldview to the digital world so that it's not creating more bias, but actually creating more interconnectedness, more interdependence, more capacity to live in a space of non-judgment, of sharing more truth and science and not conspiracies. How do we do that? Just a small thing. I think it's great that Twitter now, will sometimes write, okay, this is not something that is fact based. So things are happening.
Yeah.
And I think the more people can have those little notes around that says, this person said this, but this is not the facts as we know them. So part of it is, how are we bringing ethics and consciousness to the digital world in ways that really increase our capacity for working with truth? And I think that's a real issue for leaders around the world.
Yeah.
Is as we evolve in the VUCA world and all this turbulence, in order to really be able to have that vision, understanding, clarity, and agility, we need to have truth and facts that we work with.
Yeah.
And when we don't, well, we're not able to move forward in an agile way that transforms positively.
That's big thinking. You're at 60,000 feet, my friend.
But this is why storytelling
Global collective
is important.
consciousness. I love it.
It's important because we need to ground it. We need to ground it.
Yeah. And to your point, I love how you're framing, how do we use the digital space that we're living in and emerging into, and how do we use that for good? And how do we use that? Because to your point, Twitter can be a cesspool. In some ways, it's a reflection of some of the worst components of humanity. It's also a reflection of some of the best. And how do we elevate the truth and the best? And in some ways, what is it that attracts humans? And again, the marketers, and in some cases the media, they know how to frame it beautifully. It's like an Oreo for the mind, right? They know it's going to get clicked and even if it's healthy or not, they know that it's going to get clicked. And how do we combat some of that? Because framing the world in a different way, and to your point, helping us be more mindful, helping us see the good and live in the good and know that we have agency in creating the good. I think that's another huge component that you mentioned earlier, that I can make a difference. I can't wait to explore the story of the Nobel Prize winner who has been a part of planting 1 billion trees. It's a beautiful story.
Thank you. Yes. No, and I had the privilege of meeting Wangari Maathai before she died. And so I feel very connected to the work she did. And for me, it's how can we keep growing her legacy? And it's really important to all that I do. And I'll send you some references of different books that she wrote and books
Please.
that were written about her. And so, like, my daughter, as a toddler, she had the bio for toddlers of Wangari Maathai because that was important to me.
Yeah.
And part of it is, both you and I are both parents. How do we raise children in this world so that they become conscious transformational leaders? And so my daughter, years ago, I was invited by a friend, Michelle Buck, who's a professor at the Kellogg Business School at Northwestern. And she was teaching with Deepak Chopra, The Soul of Leadership. And I remember at the time, my daughter was 2 and I was a new mother and I was still struggling to take in all these roles. And I remember crying in Deepak's arms. And he's like, don't worry, just start meditating and everything's going to be okay.
Wow.
And I went home and I started meditating. And after a month, my husband's like, what's wrong with you? We're different. And what I did is I had my daughter start meditating. So for every age, so it's 2 minutes at 2, 3 minutes at 3, 4 minutes at 4. And now she's 16. And so there's a groundedness she has around that. And so for years, she grew a summer garden. And so part of her taking care of the garden was weeding, was planting flowers that had insecticidal properties so that they kept everything
I love it.
for food,
Yeah.
well. And so it allowed her to connect with the food system. She grew so much basil that we had pesto for the whole winter. and if you think about it, it's so here's a yard. She designed that space and she decided what she wanted to grow there, and she would decide, okay, this doesn't need to be here, and she would, pull out the weeds. And I think it's really important as we educate the next generations that they take that vision of taking care of a garden in their relationship with the cyber world, with digitalization, with the web.
Yeah.
Is how are you interacting with the web to nurture your soul or just to feed cravings?
Yeah. Yeah. Did you say feed cravings or crazy? I don't.
It can be both. It can be both. And it's very interesting because, you probably get that too, where friends of friends and, children, people send you people and say, advise them, coach them, they're lost, et cetera, et cetera. And I'll recommend different sources that they can go to nurture themselves. I'm just thinking of your podcast. It's like, there's so many really positive, nurturing sources out there that people can really use to cultivate wellness, to increase their capacity for positive action, to increase their capacity to reflect on their leadership style, for more power and for influence and for the greater good.
Yeah.
And so I'm like, why is it that most people are unaware of these resources? There's so many out there that I'm unable to take in all of the positive things that I see. And I follow people that I find amazing on Twitter.
Yeah.
I interact with interesting people on LinkedIn who are challenging me to grow and think bigger. And so these are things that, part of it is if you think a garden, you can have a beautiful garden that grows organic, nutritious foods, or you can have a neglected garden that, just has a bunch of weeds that will cause allergies.
Yes.
And so
it's a great metaphor.
Really, yes. And so it's fate or destiny. Are we consciously designing our destiny?
Wow.
And that's really where leadership comes in. And that's where what we do with children when they're young will determine their agency. And I go back to the saying that attributed to Einstein, whether it's true or not, is do you believe that the universe is a loving universe or not? And whether you believe that will determine everything in your life, because you'll see everything that will happen. Will you take it as a victim, or will you say, what can I learn from this? How can I grow from this? How can this help me help others? And how can this help me on this journey that is my life? Because when you don't believe that the universe is on your side, you're always asking, well, why is this happening to me? And this isn't the journey I'm supposed to have.
Yeah.
And so if you just accept this is the journey I'm having, and everything that is happening to me is helping me grow my capacity to love and to act and to be of service to others and to myself and my growth, then there's curiosity with everything that shows up.
Yep.
And this is where, are we creating enabling frameworks or frameworks that bring more resistance?
Yep. Enabling frameworks. That's what we will discuss next time. We will start with enabling frameworks. Okay. Now, real quick, before we close down for the day, what are you reading, streaming, listening to? What are those resources that you turn to that are appreciative, are life-giving, that are motivating?
Yes. So, I think I mentioned it right now. I'm looking at a book called All We Can Save. And the subtitle is Truth, Courage, and Solutions for the Climate Crisis.
Okay.
And it's Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson and Catherine Wilkinson.
Great.
So that's one of the books that I'm really enjoying right now. A more difficult read that I'm also engaging with is Caste: The Origins of Our Discontents, Isabel Wilkerson.
Okay.
It's a difficult read around how race issues in the U.S. over centuries has resulted in where we are, and how this can help us understand the division that is present, and how this can help us move towards healing. So it's a difficult read, but it's a beautiful read. And the other one by Pavan Sukhdev is Corporation 2020, is how can the corporations today help us move towards a more environmentally conscious world that takes into the natural capital, the social capital, and human capital into account.
Yeah. Well, and I didn't say this when we were talking in that little segment of this discussion, but I think sometimes there's a dichotomy in our minds that you can't be successful if you're sustainable, and I think you can be. Right? You can be wildly successful in a capitalistic system and do good in the world and take care of your employees. It's a both and, right?
Yes. And you know,
that's
and this
the
is
sweet spot.
It's the sweet spot. And this is, you know, when we teach polarities and managing polarities, it's about the and.
Yes.
And it's what is our capacity to hold creative tensions.
Yes.
And that goes in what is our capacity to hold diversity, and whether it's diversity in terms of human diversity and everything that is being promoted right now in terms of how do we accelerate social justice and inclusion, diversity, and equity in the world. But it's also how do we do it in the natural world in terms of bringing back biodiversity and having a more resilient world, and not just think about efficiency and 20th century manufacturing, you know, mechanical visions, but really a biological systems view of if Earth is an organism, you know, and parts are the heart or the liver. You can't say, I want to have a heart and no liver. You need all of it.
You need the lungs in the rainforest.
Yes. And so
you need the lungs.
Yes. And so part of it is how do we look at humanity in that way? And how do we embrace institutions like the World Health Organizations and what they do for us collectively? And how do we work with these institutions towards positive transfer?
We are going to start where I said we were going to start, enabling frameworks next time. It's been so much fun having a conversation. Thank you so much, Eliane. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. This was fun.
Okay. Have a great day.
Okay. You too.
I am super confident that you enjoyed that conversation as much as I did. Eliane is just such an incredible thinker. That conversation could have gone on for hours, and it will continue. I think it's it's the second episode I've named before we had the conversation, but we're going to call the next one Enabling Frameworks. Eliane did a wonderful job of reminding us the importance of storytelling. And she said a couple things that it connects our minds, our hearts, and our souls. And she also said that when all of our senses are triggered, and that meets science, when that comes together, there's some powerful results that it can occur. So the practical wisdom here is storytelling and the importance of storytelling in leadership. Until next time, have a great day, everybody. Take care and be well. You have been listening to the Practical Wisdom for Leaders podcast. If you liked what you heard, please share it with others and let them know what we're up to. And one last quick reminder to click subscribe so you know when we publish new episodes. And of course, we'd love to hear your feedback. You can stay in touch with me by visiting www.scottjallen.net or any number of social media platforms. Be well, be safe, and make a difference wherever you are on this beautiful planet. And now, here's Kate's twin sister, Emily, with the outro.
You've been listening to Phronesis, Practical Wisdom with Scott Allen.